Well, I'd like to start by thanking Costas and the other program committee members for inviting me to participate in this great gathering, and thank all of you for coming. As Costas mentioned, I'm an economist focusing on economic behavior, particularly financial economic behavior. But I think that the topic I'm going to take today actually fits very well with the theme of this workshop on algorithmic game theory and practice. I'm actually going to be talking about both theory and practice in ways that I'm hoping is going to be quite consistent with not only the workshop, but the Simons Institute of Theory of Computing. So let me begin with a little bit of motivation. The motivation is really the start of game theory, which of course is von Neumann and Morgenstern and Paul Samuelson. In 1947, the pair of books that came out, The Theory of Games and Economic Behavior and Samuelson's Foundations of Economic Analysis, really outlined for the next several generations what economists were going to be taking as the basic workhorse of how to model economic behavior, namely expected utility maximization. Maximizing an expected utility function subject to a budget constraint. So this is a theory that we still teach our PhD students in economics. It's pretty much the only theory that economists will use, certainly in financial economics. And it's only over the course of the last few years that we've begun chipping away at this incredibly successful edifice. And the chipping away has to do with the fact that in practice, these theories don't work. Expected utility maximization falls short in any number of contexts. And in some early work that my co-author Craig McKinley and I did years ago, we showed that, for example, the random walk hypothesis, which is part of this edifice of predicting economic behavior under certain circumstances, that can easily be rejected in the data. And many other documented departures from rationality and the theory of expected utility has come through by psychologists and behavioral economists. So I want to give you an example of one of these violations because it seems so strange, particularly given what we think of as normal rational behavior. It has to do with something called probability matching. Some of you who've studied psychology or behavioral finance might have come across this, but otherwise you may not have. It's a simple game where I've got a coin, and I toss it one after another, and you try to guess whether it's going to be heads or tails at each toss. And if you're correct, I pay you $1, and if you're not correct, you pay me $1. And we're going to do this multiple times. And I'll tell you right now that it's my coin that we're going to use, and it's not necessarily a fair coin. In fact, what happens is after several tosses, you notice that it comes up heads about 3 times more frequently than tails. So empirically, you observe that it's roughly 75% heads, 25% tails. So question, what is the rational economic strategy that you would undertake once you observe this empirical fact? What should you guess? Heads, all the time. Of course, that will maximize your expected winnings. When you actually try this out on subjects, it turns out that people don't do this. They don't do heads all the time. What they do is this. They actually randomize. And oddly enough, the frequency with which they pick tails actually matches the 75-25 split. They will pick heads 75% of the time and pick tails 25% of the time. And what's even more interesting is that if sometime during the sequence of games you switch the coin surreptitiously from a 75-25 coin to a 60-40 coin, after another 10 or 20 trials, they actually change to 60-40. They will match the probability. And what's even more stunning is that this behavior is found not just in humans, but in ants, fish, pigeons, primates. Virtually any creature that can choose between A versus B will actually behave in this manner. They will engage in this probability matching. And so the question is, why is this the case? This seems so irrational from an economic perspective. And given that it's in common with so many different species, there has to be a deeper explanation. So my co-authors and I, Tom Brennan and Ray-Shin Zhang, we started looking at this and trying to understand what the underpinnings are of behavior. And so let me just give you a quick summary, and then I'll dive into the results. What we do in a series of papers, some of which are published, others of which are ongoing, and you can find them on my website, and we cite them in the slides, so you're all welcome to have a copy. What we've come to is an explanation that really tries to address the question of where these behaviors come from. What are their origins? Why are they there? Are they created equal, or do they have differences? And what we've concluded is that there is a very simple framework for explaining all of these things from an evolutionary perspective. So what we do is to provide a framework where we can derive risk aversion, loss aversion, randomization, mixed strategies, all sorts of behavioral anomalies that economists feel are not consistent with expected utility maximization. We can derive those behaviors in a very primitive way, and I'll describe to you how primitive it is based on the simple model that we use. And so we argue that behavioral biases, the irrationalities that we document in financial markets, are really hardwired forms of adaptations that may seem irrational from the narrow perspective of financial decision making, but when you look at it from a broader perspective, you understand why they're there. It doesn't mean that they're any less irrational from that perspective, but at least we understand why they're there and why it may be impossible to eliminate them unless you change the environment. And the environment is really the key to understanding behavior. What we're going to show is that it's the underlying risk of reproduction that will explain a lot of the emergence of these kinds of behaviors. And it's different kinds of risk that explain different kinds of behavior. So that's sort of the nature of the narrative. And in particular, I want to distinguish between two kinds of risk: systematic risk versus idiosyncratic risk. These are very much along the same lines of what financial economists have been thinking about, but it's done in a very, very different context. This is a much more of a biological and evolutionary context. So that framework will then provide a very natural definition for what intelligence is and what the bounds on intelligence might be. So we're going to ultimately come back full circle to what Herbert Simon proposed decades ago on this bounded rationality and satisficing behavior. We're going to provide an evolutionary foundation for his work, and it ultimately forms the mathematical basis for what I've been calling over the last few years the adaptive markets hypothesis. Those of you who've studied finance in any bit, you probably run across the efficient markets hypothesis. Most people in practice don't believe the efficient markets hypothesis because they know that investors can actually make money under certain circumstances with the right kinds of technologies, and that flies in the face of efficiency. This framework will actually provide a nice resolution of that contradiction. I won't have time to do a thorough literature review. The work we do cuts across lots of different literatures. We cite the relevant papers in our study, so you're welcome to take a look at it. But one of the literatures that it does very much overlap with is evolutionary game theory and algorithmic game theory, mechanism design. I'll make a few of those connections along the way. Okay, so let me first start with the very simple model, and once you see how simple it is, you'll understand what I mean when I say this is a very primitive explanation for how these kinds of behaviors emerge. The model is a very simple binary choice model. I'm going to start with a group of asexual semiparous individuals. That's a very fancy way of saying I'm going to talk about objects that don't engage in any kind of sexual reproduction. They simply give birth to multiple offspring, and they give birth only once in their life, and they die. So these are not necessarily humans. These could be bacteria or just general theoretical creatures that we won't really need to worry about for a moment. I'll come back and talk a bit about the realism a little bit later on. So these individuals, they live a one period, and then they make one decision in their lifetimes, choosing between A versus B. These are two generic choices. They could be where to nest, they could be foraging strategies, they could be all sorts of different kinds of behavior, but I'm going to call that A versus B. And that decision determines the number of offspring that they will have. They'll either get XA, which is a random variable, or they'll get XB, which is another random variable. And the only assumption I'm going to make about their behavior is that the offspring behave exactly like their parents. So there's perfect genetic transmission, if you will. There's no mutation, there's no differentiation. The parents are going to transmit their behavior perfectly to the next generation. And so what do I mean by behavior? What I mean by behavior is how you choose between A versus B. I'm going to assume a really simple-minded behavior, which is that these individuals engage in Bernoulli trials. They will choose A with probability F and they will choose B with probability 1 minus F. And so this parameter F is really what defines behavior in this very simple context. And I'm going to assume that F can be anything between 0 and 1, including 0 or 1. So you can have deterministic behavior. Individuals that always pick A, for them, F is equal to 1. Individuals that always pick B, for them, F equals 0. Individuals that choose 50-50, F is equal to a half. And the only thing you have to know about behavior here is that the parents and the children have the exact same F. Okay? Now, the behavior has nothing to do with the random variables. I'm assuming that this choice of A versus B is completely statistically independent of everything and anything in the entire system here. Okay? So you can think of it as just mindless choice behavior of A versus B. Little x is the number of offspring you will get if you choose A, and little xb is the number of offspring you will get if you choose B, and xa and xb are both random variables. Okay? And in a minute, I'll assume something about their statistical distribution, but for now, all you need to know is that they're different random variables, right? Different distributions. And yeah.
So there is an important distinction between the outcome and the strategy.
Yes.
If I choose a mixed strategy,
that's right.
Even though there will be a deterministic outcome, and
right.
will have a deterministic number of offsprings,
yeah. Well,
not necessarily,
right.
Even though they were a result of the outcome, they will inherit the mixed strategy.
That's right. Exactly right. Yes. And so I'm assuming that how you behave, which is summarized by F, that's what's inherited by your offspring, by all of your offspring. All of them will be the same F. Once an F, always an F. Okay?
I think it's important, it's how you think will be inherited, because your behaviors, I chose, it's true that I randomized, but if I associate behavior with the outcome, it's like I chose B, but I had a random strategy, and that's what they inherit.
Right.
So,
that's right.
So using the word, they inherit my behavior, I think is...
Well, I mean, I think there's a semantic subtlety here, and the semantic subtlety that I'm adopting is that behavior is F. F could be a mixed strategy, but it could also be a deterministic strategy. So, but it's the F that matters. Yes, that's right. Now, what biologists care about, though, is not so much F. What they would care about is the XA and the XB. And as an economist, I have no interest in that. All I care about is the statistical distributions, the properties of XA and XB as it relates to behavior, F. So I'm going to summarize XA and XB by this joint distribution function. I'm simply going to assume that it exists, it's well defined, it's got some reasonable properties that will allow me to compute means and variances, and that's about it. Otherwise, it's absolutely general. So all of the information about the environment, about the resources, about the biology of reproduction, about the genetic transmission, all of that is subsumed by this distribution function.
F does not affect phi.
It does not. F is totally statistically, well, F is not a random variable, but it is completely devoid of any kind of relationship, any systematic relationship with the distribution or XA or XB. So it's literally totally mindless behavior. Okay? So the idea is that I start out with this individual that chooses using this parameter F, and I let the individual reproduce over many, many generations, and after a while I get a bunch of Fs. So what I want to do is to start with all possible Fs between 0 and 1, including 0 and 1, and let them reproduce. And over time, I want to see whether or not there's any particular F that seems to be overrepresented. The one that grows the fastest will be the one that I claim from an evolutionary perspective dominates. And that is the behavior that I'm claiming is selected by evolution.
So Andrew, when you draw the tree, you're operating under expectation. Like in the reality, you're gonna go either left or right, and then either like some of my descendants either left or right.
Right. Exactly right. Yes. So you start off, going left or right with a particular F, and then your offspring will do the same, and they'll do the same and the same and the same. And after a while, you just get a whole bunch of different Fs. If you start off with the same number of each type, you can get to see over time whether or not there is an F that dominates. Now, it turns out that there is an f that dominates. In this case, it's the green one, f4. But in practice, if you assume something about the distribution phi, you can actually get a very explicit expression for the f that emerges out of this evolutionary process. So let me first assume that this distribution phi of xa and xb, I'm going to assume that it is identical within a generation and independent and identical across generations. Let me just spend a minute describing the intuition for that. If we're a part of the same generation, then what it means to say that it's identical is that if you pick A, you're going to get XA. If I pick A, I'm going to get the very same XA. Not just the same distribution, the same outcome. It's the same random variable. It's identical distributions, right? Instead, I could have assumed that we have identical and independent distributions. So if you pick A, you get your draw of XA, and I get a separate independent draw from the same distribution. I'm not assuming that. In this case, I'm assuming we get the actual same realization, okay? So the way that you can think about it from a biological perspective is we're part of the same ecosystem, and therefore, if we choose the same path, because of our comparable biologies, we get the same number of offspring.
So, is there any assumption about the means of XA and XA?
No. No assumptions about that. That's actually going to be, that'll come in later. We're going to derive that as a result. So I'm going to assume that this distribution is identical across individuals, but over time, the next generation, they get their own draw of XA, XB. So statistically, it's independent over time, but it's dependent, it's perfectly dependent cross-sectionally within a given generation. David?
So something just seems a little tricky about that it's identical, which is then you need the decision to be synchronous. Because I worry that if the decision wasn't synchronous, then depending on the timing, somehow I would see, oh, XA was good, therefore I will pick.
Well, so yes. Well, I mean, implicitly, I'm assuming that these decisions are being made within a single generation at the same time.
And maybe there's a delay, we don't get to see XA.
That's right. That's right. Sure. Exactly. But there's no gaming here. There's no intelligence here. There's no strategy going on. You have to really think about these as dumb little bacteria, not to insult bacteria in the audience, but just think about this as mindless, which is, in this case, a feature, not a bug. Okay. So individuals are mindless. They're not optimizers. Yeah, sorry, but pun intended. Which F survives? In this very simple framework, can you find an F that survives over many, many generations beyond all other Fs? It turns out that what I've described just now, you can actually calculate what Ernst Mayr called, the principle of evolution, the fact that it's the process of elimination. You can find an F that grows the fastest in just what I've described. And that F star, the one that has the maximal growth rate, that's the behavior that emerges through this very, very artificial evolutionary selection process. Okay? So let me show you how. I have to do a little bit of population arithmetic. I'm not going to take you through the math, but it's pretty straightforward, actually. The number of type Fs at time t in the population is simply given by the number of type F parents in the previous generation and the number of offspring when they chose A versus B. And if you use the law of large numbers, you can actually show very easily that ultimately the growth rate of type F individuals is given by the expected logarithm of the f of xa times 1 minus f of xb. And so if you want to find the f that grows the fastest, you just have to optimize this growth rate as a function of f. It turns out that this geometric growth rate is a globally concave function in f, so it's got a unique maximum. And you can actually calculate it very easily. It's high school algebra. If xa over xb is defined as the variable r, you can think of r as the relative benefits of xa versus xb, the number of offspring of xa versus xb. It's a random variable. There will be, yes. So this is a random variable. So it turns out that the optimal growth rate, the optimal behavior, the behavior that maximizes the growth rate, f star, is going to be equal to 1 if the expectation of r is greater than 1 and the expectation of the reciprocal is less than 1, so this is your question about the means, if it turns out that xa is much better than xb, and much better means the expected ratio is greater than 1 and the expected reciprocal is less than 1, that means that A is going to be much better than B in terms of the number of offspring. That means that in order to maximize your growth rate, you really should pick A all the time. If the reverse is true, then you should pick B all the time. But because it's a random variable, this can happen. You can actually have the expectation of r being greater than or equal to 1 and the expectation of the reciprocal of r being less than or equal to 1. And if that happens, greater than or equal to 1, both of them can be greater than or equal to 1. If that happens, then the optimal solution, the solution that maximizes the growth rate, is to randomize with this particular level of randomization. F star is going to be the solution to this implicit equation. And so this looks a lot like an Euler equation from an economic expected utility maximization, but there's no utility going on. This is merely a process of selection. And effectively what you're going to be doing is equalizing the expected number of offspring for XA versus XB, depending on your choice of A versus B. Michael?
Can you say what role your assumption about there being common draws from
Yes.
is playing in this result?
Huge role.
But more specifically, if you didn't have that, if you had private draws, would this middle case go away?
Well, yes, it would.
You would have concentration of
Exactly right. So can you hold off 5 minutes? Because I'm going to come right back. That's a hugely important case, and that I'll get to. Yes. But for now, what this says is that there are circumstances where you will not pick A for sure or B for sure. You will randomize. So let me give you a very quick illustration. This just shows that for any other behavior, you can show that the number of F primes are going to be vanishingly small relative to F star. That is, F star will take over the population geometrically fast. Okay, so let me just give you a simple example of that and then show you some of the other implications that you're already getting at. So here's an example that I came up with to try to develop intuition for what's going on here. Suppose you have a very simple ecology where you've got a 75% chance of sunshine and a 25% chance of rain. And suppose in this very simple environment, the creature that is involved has to make a simple decision about where to build its nest. And the creature has two choices: to build the nest in the valley or on top of a plateau. And the nice thing about the valley is that it has shade and it also has a stream with water. So in case it's sunny, then your offspring, if you build your nest in the valley, will be 3, because the valley protects your offspring from the deadly rays of the sun, and there's plenty of water, so your offspring will be able to survive, and therefore you'll be able to successfully reproduce. On the other hand, if it rains and you build your nest in the valley, that's bad news. You're going to be extinct, because in that case, the river floods, drowning your offspring. So that's bad news. It's exactly the opposite if you build your nest on top of a plateau. On top of a plateau, when the sun is out, your offspring will burn to death. There's no water on the plateau. It'll all evaporate, so they'll either die of thirst or exposure. But if it rains and you're on top of the plateau, that's good news, because the cloud will protect your offspring from the sun, and there will be rain, and so your offspring will have plenty to drink. All right? So 75% chance of sunshine, 25% chance of rain. You are the optimizing, efficient economists deciding where to build your nest. Where should you build your nest? Always in the valley. Always build your nest in the valley, because that's got the highest probability of survival. If you want to maximize the number of offspring you've got, you should always pick the valley. Well, let's see what happens. So I'm going to run a simulation with a lot of different behaviors. So f equal to 0.2, f equal to 0.5, f equal to 0.75, and here are the economists, f equal to 1. Always build your nest in the valley.
What if you don't want to maximize your number of offspring, but you want to maximize the probability that your species survives or something?
Well, that's a different kind of utility function. Now you've got intergenerational considerations. Let me come back to that. All right? There is a way to trick it so that you can get to the ultimate bottom line. But for the selfish optimizing one-period maximizers, this is what you get. The economists, they tend to grow the fastest. They grow faster, 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 faster. They take over the population, whoops, until something happens. What happened? What happened, of course, is that it rained. Sorry, I teach MBA students, so I have to have sound effects. The first time it rains, the entire population of economists get wiped out, which may be a good thing, depending on your point of view. What this suggests is that optimizing behavior, this kind of very selfish, one-period optimizing behavior is not sustainable, because the first time that it rains, and getting back to Michael's point, because you've got shared risk, you're all part of the same ecosystem, the same ecological niche, as soon as it rains, you're all wiped out. This behavior no longer exists in the population. And because I'm assuming that there's no mutation, this behavior never comes back. So I'll get back to mutation a little bit later on. It turns out that the behavior that grows the fastest is the one where you match the probability of sunshine, f equal to 0.75. And again, the reason that works is because in this case, you're actually equalizing the expected number of offspring per population in both potential states of the world. The mathematical framework is very simple. In our model, if you assume that phi is also a binomial, you actually get this situation where in the state of the world where it is sunny, m offspring or 0. In the state of the world where it's rainy, 0 versus m. If you assume this for phi, what you get is that the optimal behavior is to match probabilities. Probability matching comes out of this very, very simple framework. Now, of course, this is a function of these very, very specific parameters and the fact that the outcomes are anti-correlated across the two states of the world. It's that there is no clear winner in terms of A versus B. It depends on the environment. It depends on the risk.
So there seems to be something kind of special about the case where one of the outcomes is 0.
Well, no, actually, if
That's what I'm wondering.
yes, there isn't. So it turns out that 0 makes it easier for me to explain how the behavior disappears. But if you make it more general, so CA1, CAB1, CA2, CB2, and you assume that the relative values are R1 and R2, it turns out that you can solve, based on our very simple framework, you can actually calculate the optimal behavior. It looks like this. And probability matching occurs when this F star is approximately equal to P, and that will happen when these two conditions occur. So this is more than you ever wanted to know about probability matching. This basically solves for all types of environments. Every point on this graph is a particular set of parameters for that distribution phi. And so this is where the relative outcome of A versus B under the state of the world 1, where it's sunny. This is the outcome of A versus B when it's rainy. It turns out that if A is much better than B in both states of the world, you always pick 1. If it's always worse in that state of the world, you always pick 0. And this black line right here, that line is exact probability matching. For every combination of the various different parameters, you will get exact probability matching. In between these two white curves, you'll get randomization, but it won't be exact probability matching.
So that's where, you started with the motivation of exact probability matching. It seems so robust in behavior.
Right.
It seems very non-generic in the
Exactly.
parameters.
That's right. It is non-generic. It's non-generic in the sense that depending on the environment, you can get very different behavior. So if the environment looks like this, you look like economists. If the environment looks like this, you look quite irrational. And if the environment is in between here, you look very, very indecisive. But the fact is that it's the environment that's driving this. That's really the point of this, that the nature of the risks actually matter a great deal. And by the way, this also seems, from a very primitive perspective, to look a lot like altruism in a strange way. Remember, this is all mindless, right? There's no social interaction. There's no strategic decision-making. But think about the way that the narrative plays out for this valley versus plateau discussion. So imagine we're all part of the same generation. and we're all deciding where to nest. And we, over many, many generations, have come up with F star of 0.75. That's who we are. So the discussion will go something like this. Okay, some of us are going to go into the valley. 75% of us, in fact. 25% needs to go up in the plateau. So you back there, you go up to the plateau. The chances are you're not going to survive, but it's for the good of the group. So please take one for the team and go up there. And they do. It sounds like altruism, that 25% that goes on the plateau, because they have a very large chance of not surviving. There's nothing going on, though, of that type. It's not a social interaction. It's simply selection, nature selecting based upon systematic risk. Now, let me get to Michael's point. Oh, yeah.
What did you call us irrational in the red region? It sounds rational to me.
It is rational under the circumstances. Yes, it is rational rational in the sense that it will maximize your survival. But but when you're taking a look at the behavior may not correspond to what you think of as rational for a given instance.
This is as rational as blue, right? Red and blue, like extreme.
If you understand what's going on with the selection process, yes, you can interpret it that way. But for the same reason that if you're on the black line, it is rational to randomize, but it looks like it's irrational from the perspective of one period survival. From a multi-period perspective, if you have a different preference function, if you construct an infinite horizon preference function where you care about the infinite future, you can concoct a mechanism where it looks rational from that perspective. But we don't need to do that. Occam's razor says this is a simpler explanation for how that emerges.
I had the same question, and I was wondering, maybe I'm misunderstanding the graph, but the way I understood it is that in that red one, we're always picking B.
That's right. B is much better.
Because B is better.
Is it?
There's nothing irrational about it.
There's nothing irrational about it. What my point about the irrationality comment is that you're talking about deterministic behavior now. And deterministic behavior, if you interpret it as, something that doesn't correspond to your intuition about what you ought to be doing, it may seem as if it's irrational. You're not optimizing over individual one-period outcomes. What you're trying to do is to capture the survival rates of the various different individuals. So yes, it's fine to call this rational, but we have to actually define what we mean by rational, and I haven't talked about that yet. All I'm saying is that what nature is selecting on is long-term survival, whereas in fact what we think about as rational or irrational has to do with the context of the individual decision.
Andrew, in the case where you always select 0, when F star is 0, isn't that exactly the case where you're also maximizing your next generation?
In this case, yes.
That's rational in both senses then.
In this case, yes, and in this case, yes. In between the white lines, no.
We just all got confused when you called red irrational because you're maximizing both kinds of rationality.
You're right. Sorry, I misspoke. Absolutely. This does look rational from the economics perspective, as does this in this case. Because in this case, there's no doubt that A dominates B. The area where there's irrationality is in between the white lines, where it's not clear now what looks rational or irrational. But from a survival perspective, it is clear. Okay. So let me get to the point that Michael made, which is if I make one simple change in my assumption, if I change the assumption that you and I in the same population, in the same generation, have identical distributions to we have independent and identical distributions, it turns out that these results go away. The so-called irrationality of mixed strategies, it really depends heavily on this assumption. So now I'm going to change this and make it IID instead of perfectly dependent, perfectly identically distributed. So essentially what I'm assuming is idiosyncratic reproductive risk, meaning your draw is different from my draw. It's the same distribution, but it's a statistically independent draw. So when you do that, the population arithmetic changes in a very, very minor way, but has major implications. Instead of the same draw for all of us in the same generation that pick A, we now have individual random variables. And so when you apply the law of large numbers within a given generation, you don't get a random variable anymore. Now you get the mean of that random variable. And therefore, the growth rate here, it's non-stochastic. In which case, if you want to optimize the growth rate, F is either 0, if mu b is greater than mu a, or it's 1 if mu a is greater than mu b. You get a deterministic solution. And so in this example here, what it corresponds to in terms of the IID assumption is now you and I, we're not part of the same valley or the same plateau. We each have our own microclimates, sort of like the way it is here in California. Whether you're in the Bay or whatever, on the coast or in the mountains, you have very different kinds of environments. When you run the simulation now, what you find is that economists end up ruling the day. They grow faster than all of the other elements because the probability that all of the economists get wiped out at the same time is vanishingly small, given that they have IID draws. So another way of putting this is that when nature is systematic, when nature forces you into an environment where you're all facing the same risk, your behavior has to diversify that kind of risk. You can't afford to be systematic as well. When nature is idiosyncratic, that's when you can afford to be systematic. So another way of putting it is nature abhors an undiversified bet.
So do economists. So economists, the notion of diversification and systematic versus idiosyncratic.
Exactly.
I love the work.
Yes.
It could be a bit more generous to economists in saying that the economic approach might get you to choose f equals 1 when risk is idiosyncratic and get you to choose f equals 0.75 when risk.
It does. I don't mean to be ungenerous to economists, but the reason that I don't talk about the economic intuition here is because the economic intuition relies on an assumption of risk aversion and utility functions, which is why you care about diversification. This is much more primitive. You don't need that. There's no assumption of any kind of behavior whatsoever, other than you got all the behaviors represented. But what it does say is that the economic intuition is actually very important, and it carries over in a much more general way. So, for example, the sharp cap M and the role of systematic risk, that actually has much more importance above and beyond equilibrium theory. You don't need equilibrium in order to show why systematic risk is important.
I get what you're doing. It's just a terminology.
Okay.
I appreciate the work.
So there is, on this topic of economists, so there is a literature that says that if you want to maximize the growth rate of your portfolio, you should use
log.
The log.
Yes.
And then from the viewpoint of this model, the agent is not an individual, it's the group.
It's the population.
The group is just maximizing the growth rate.
Right.
His portfolio, no, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket.
Right.
That generates this.
That's right. There is a relationship, but the relationship is not one-to-one. We have a paper that we're working on that shows the origin of log utility from this framework. But the reason that this works, and the reason this is so similar, is because what you're doing, what nature does, is to maximize the geometric growth rate of a population. And that's tantamount to essentially nature having log utility. That's what's going on. But the utility here is really just the population. It's not any kind of function that we're arbitrarily imposing. So I'm just about out of time, so let me just try to wrap up very quickly and talk about bounded rationality and intelligence. So as I mentioned, Herbert Simon was the first person who proposed this notion of satisficing as an alternative to optimization. But his work has actually had less impact in economics, at least when it first came out. I think more and more people are appreciating the importance of what he's done now. But he had a big impact on AI. And part of the reason that economists dismissed his work originally was because his notion of satisficing didn't contain any particular mechanism for coming up with the appropriate heuristics. He just said that heuristics have to be good enough, but the question is how do they become good enough? Where do you get them from? And we propose that this evolutionary framework can actually describe where that comes from. So the idea that I first started talking about, which is that your behavior, this Bernoulli trial, A versus B, is statistically independent of everything. That's mindless behavior. What if we allow your decision to actually be correlated with the random variables of your offspring? So in other words, what if it's the case that every time you chose XA, it actually happened to be better than XB? And every time you chose XB, it happened to be better than XA? In other words, what if you had predictive power to be able to figure out whether or not A is going to be better than B? So effectively, you knew which was going to have the higher mean, for example. You had information. That's what we're calling intelligence. It's basically the ability to forecast A versus B. And it turns out that there's a very natural evolutionary definition of intelligence from this framework. It's anything that gives you a reproductive advantage. And you can see that by defining what stupidity is, the opposite of intelligence. What do we mean by stupid? It's these kinds of behaviors, right? So two folks in the bathtub, or the pool, they've got a nice stereo going, and they've got an extension cord on these slippers right in the middle of the water. Very smart. Or somebody here taking a picture of an alligator, here fixing the car with a piece of wood propped up. These are examples of behavior that we call stupid. Why? Because they're counterproductive to survival. So if that's what we mean by intelligence, that is, it gives you a reproductive advantage, we can actually incorporate that in our model very simply. If we allow covariance between our actions and the outcomes to be greater than 0, that's intelligence right there. It gives you a reproductive success, an advantage. And so it turns out that you can actually analyze that in the framework of our context of the model, where you basically have correlation now between your action and the outcomes. And you can show that, obviously, if you can get that correlation to be 1, you're going to grow the fastest. In general, we can't make the correlation equal to 1, so there's some nonlinear surface that will allow various different state variables to give us predictive power. That gives us various kinds of behaviors that could be optimal because we have different methods of forecasting XA versus XB. Okay. Lots of other extensions, including mutation, strategic behavior. We've assumed that your actions have no bearing on my actions and outcomes. If it turns out that we change that assumption so that when I choose something that affects your outcome, out of that will emerge strategic behavior and planning and forward-looking and all that kind of stuff. The most important extension that we're working on now is actually to change this framework to think about not just one choice at a time, but to string a bunch of choices together. So it's easy. These are all Bernoulli choices. If you bring them together, you get a binomial tree. You can imagine that now the kind of behaviors you can get are much, much more complex. It's not just A versus B, but you get binary strings of behavior. And of course, that looks a lot like human thought. It's evolution at the speed of thought. That's where we hope to go with this, to be able to provide a little bit more of a generalization for the framework. Thank you.
You may have touched on this a little bit at the end, Andrew, but I totally am on board with the idea that evolution has a role to play in understanding the way we operate and reason. But you didn't get into computational limitations as another part of this.
Yes.
What's your opinion on that?
So that's actually the last part that I had to rush over since we're running out of time. The idea is that if you think about correlation as being a source of intelligence, in other words, my actions actually end up being positively correlated with good outcomes, then the question is, how do you get that correlation? That's where computational limits come in. If there's no limit to resources, physiological or environmental, I should be able to drive that correlation to 1. I can predict perfectly when I'm going to miscarriage versus when I'm going to have a great set of offspring. But the fact is that we can't do that because of these limitations. So computational limits, I would think of them as more environmental constraints as well as physiological constraints. That actually imposes a constraint on the amount of computing you can do to calculate those kinds of correlations. So you can call that computational limits, but from a biological perspective, that comes about because you've got environmental and physiological constraints.
Can you say something more, a little bit more about the strategic planning and the lookout part?
Yeah. So I started out with mindless behavior, totally random, and out of that came these, risk aversion, loss aversion, and so on. If instead I made assumptions that my outcome is actually influenced by your action, what that means is that over time, what will evolve out of that primordial soup are abilities for you to engage in certain actions that will prevent me from reproducing so that you can reproduce more advantageously. So if you assume that there is an ability to have memory, and if you assume that that ability allows you to engage in pattern recognition, then again, assuming all sorts of behavior, including that kind of behavior, you'll find that strategic planning and forward-looking behavior will emerge out of that process.
So now you're going to be evolving a net. It sounds like maybe there's no single left that is good. Like
there isn't.
sources?
Well, so that correlation function that I showed you, correlation is a function of lots of state variables. So you can be better predictor because you're faster, you're stronger, you've got visual acuity, you've got lots of different advantages. There are many different ways of creating that correlation. It doesn't matter from an evolutionary perspective where the correlation comes from. It just matters that every time you choose A, you actually have a survival advantage. So what that suggests is there are many different kinds of creatures that will emerge, each with its own way of advantageously choosing A versus B. So yes, there won't be a unique kind of individual. There'll be many forms of intelligence, if you will. Yes?
What happens when you have mutation also in the model?
Yeah, so we didn't get to do that, but that's one of the things that we're working on. The way that we get sex, first of all, is very good. You probably already knew that. I didn't have to tell you. The reason that sex is good is because in this model without sex, once a particular behavior disappears, it never comes back. But if you allow for mutation, so we have another model which says that your offspring, 99.9% of the time, if you're an F, your offspring's an F. But 0.1% of the time, it's not an F. It's anything other than an F, uniformly, between 0 and 1. If you make that one assumption, it turns out that, first of all behaviors are always represented in a population, first of all. And second of all, here's the other really weird thing that I think biologists understand intuitively, but we didn't. It turns out that there is no optimal growth rate any longer. It turns out that if you introduce mutation, everything grows at exactly the same rate. All the Fs grow at the same rate, slightly less than F star without mutation. But you can prove that. And what's going on there is that mutation is basically nature's insurance policy. In other words, no matter what the environment is, there will always be some behavior that will be optimal for that environment. Whereas before, if I didn't have mutation, if the environment shifts, it could be that everybody gets wiped out. So we actually are able to derive the optimal mutation rate as a function of how easily or how much the environment shifts from one to the other. So mutation actually changes everything. And the kind of behaviors that you get ultimately end up being a lot more complicated. You don't have a single F star anymore. All of the Fs actually grow at the same rate. That doesn't mean that you have the same population. It's random. It changes over time. And we can characterize the limiting distribution using ergodic theory. So that's a paper that is in the works. We're happy to send you copies if you're interested. Yes?
So, I wanted to understand the first part where you talked about probability matching for humans. So there's the prospect theory, sort of low probabilities get overweight, high probabilities get underweight, and so forth. So how does that factor into this framework? Because there, it seems like it wouldn't exactly be probability matching. There should be some kind of adjustment for low.
Right. So our view is that human decision-making is a lot more complicated because layered on top of this very primitive mechanism are lots of other mechanisms. As I showed you, every time you change the parameters of that phi distribution, you actually change the behavior. So what we're trying to do now is experiments, very simple probability matching experiments where we change the reward structure to see whether or not we can generate that kind of behavior. So neural plasticity is a fancy way of saying that we adapt to changing environmental conditions. And so over time, I believe that evolution has given us the ability to do that, to change. So there's multiple mechanisms that we have, and it's very complicated to tell what the mechanism is unless you understand what the environment is. Once you define the environment, the phi distribution, you should be able to figure out what the behavior will emerge that will be optimal relative to that environment. Yes, and then
coming back to the question before this last one, what you said seems really surprising to me, and I want to understand that better. So you're saying that all of the Fs grow at the same rate, but it seems that there are some really stupid Fs, at least for some environments, maybe even dominated Fs. So how can those grow at the same rate as something better?
Because the environment shifts over time. And so once the environment shifts, that particular F will not be optimal. And so in the limit, as you have all of these shifts going on, the only way that you can have equilibrium, that you can, when you optimize, they all grow at the same rate.
But that seems to somehow assume something about the rate of shifting and all
Yes, yes, it does.
Not general.
No. It's not general in the sense that we're assuming that the environment changes over time. There's some kind of stochastic change in the environment.
But it has to be enough change, right?
Yeah. Well, the rate of mutation is going to be linked to the amount of change. So, for example, if the environment never changes, then mutation doesn't really benefit you.
What do you mean by environment changing?
The phi function. If the phi function is stable over time, then mutation doesn't benefit you. But if the phi function shifts over time, then mutation will, by benefit, I mean, it will allow some species to survive. And so that's why it's there. If you assume that there exists some mechanism for which species will survive, this is the mechanism that will allow that to emerge. Yes?
This might also relate back to a couple of the earlier questions. But so I was trying to understand the relation between this and some of the earlier work on market selection. So like the Bloom and Easley type of work, where even if you don't have utilities, the investors who balance their wealth correctly across options grow faster than everyone else, and so they end up with a larger share of the wealth in the market.
Right. So it's related in one sense that they're making the same kind of argument, but their focus is on a particular kind of utility functions, and their definition of survival is money. What we're using is a much more primitive notion of survival, and based upon the different environments, we're getting lots of different kinds of behaviors. So in their model, it's been a while since I read it, but in their model, I believe they assume that you've got hedge fund managers that have log utility, and then you've got normal people that have risk aversion coefficients of constant relative risk aversion 2 to 5 to 10. And in that setting, the folks that survive are the hedge fund managers, because they're the ones that are taking the biggest risks. So what we're doing is a bit more general in the sense that we're allowing for different kinds of environmental conditions, and we can generate their results from what we do, but we can actually show in certain conditions that not only will the hedge fund managers dominate, but nobody else will survive. In other conditions, the hedge fund managers won't survive. It'll actually be the risk-averse individuals that will.
Okay, let's take further questions in the break. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.